Knocking around at linear fisheries in the 90s, I got to witness some incredible feats of angling. There was a small group of guys that just dominated those waters back then. And casting my mind back, one of the key aspects to what they did was their incredible ability to bait accurately at range. We all take spotting for granted these days, but back then there was only a very small group of guys that could do it as well as these guys did. And one of the guys that could do it was a guy called Cliff Kemp. I used to fish alongside Cliff for a few years back then, and I can remember taking loads of photographs for him and just seeing him catch fish after fish after fish. Well, we haven't seen each other much for about 15 years, but now he's joined Team Blake's. Today we're having a bit of a social session on a little estate lake in Oxfordshire. So I thought we'd poke a camera in his face and we'd ask him some questions about how they did it back then, what he's been up to since, and what he's got lined up for tomorrow. He's just tackling up the bank. We're going to go and flick the kettle on and have a little catch up. Right, so the sun's setting on another day here in Oxfordshire, and I'm on the banks of a good friend, Cliff Kemp. Now, many of you will have heard his name, certainly around linear fisheries. That's where I bumped into him all them years ago. So, I've got some questions here for you, Kempy.
Go on in, far ahead.
Where did you start carp fishing?
Okay, so I kind of started initially fishing from about the age of 6, and that was effectively fishing for small stuff, roach, perch, that kind of stuff. And probably when I was 13 I progressed on to night fishing. I had a friend who was a couple of years older than I was, so I was allowed to go night fishing at that point, and obviously then started to target tench and bream. And basically carp in those days were these mythical creatures that were seen but never caught, and I kind of never dreamt that I'd ever catch one. But from when I was probably about 16, I started to, there was a little lake in the middle of, between two villages, middle of nowhere effectively, that held lots of small carp, and effectively I sort of started catching sort of singles, 7, 8 pound. In those days I was really pleased with. Yeah.
And then I sort of heard your name probably around the mid-90s when you fished a very well-known water called Elstow.
Yes, so leading on from my early days, my first double figure carp I caught was from a lake called Alsey Lake, which is sort of famous for the Alsey bomb. Mm-hmm. And basically caught free lining pretty close in the margin with frozen sausage meat. And I caught my first 12 pound carp. It was my first double. And I basically used to fish another lake which was formerly known as the Pool Cath, but became known as Withy Pool.
Yeah, good old Withy.
And I caught one overnighter when I was probably upper teens. I caught an 18 pound carp, which was my PB for a while.
huge fish.
Yeah, so then I caught my first 20 pound carp from a lake called Waveney Valley Lakes, D. So that was quite late in life. I was probably in low 20s at that point.
Right.
But yeah, so later on I kind of moved on to a lot of local club lakes around my part of the world, places like Blenheim and the L-Shape and stuff. But I moved on to Elstow, in the mid-early 90s. Mm-hmm. And in those days there was a lot of fish in there. You know, I'm thinking well over 1,000. Mainly doubles, because it was a clay pit. It was sort of a soft mouth, so you know I remember quite frustrating. You'd lose a few in those early days until their mouths got toughened up with once they were caught a few times. Yeah. But yeah, so Elstow was like the centre of my world for a long time, and lucky enough to catch my first 30 from Elstow now, back in the day.
Again, I ran into you when we was fishing St John's, and you were part of a little clique of lads that were incredibly efficient at baiting up at range, like more so than anyone else I could see. And do you think that came from your days at Elstow?
Yeah, 100%. So when I first started spodding, it was days long before there were any spods you could buy, so effectively it was quite specialised because we actually made our own spods from shampoo bottles and conditioner bottles, that kind of stuff, and having to drill holes and melt holes. And obviously our spod rods. My first spod was I remember it now, was it was a sea fishing rod. It was a Chevron Surfmaster.
Showing your age now.
Basically glass fibre, so it was quite forgiving, and was a good little rod for general spodding in those days. So we cut our teeth fishing little local lakes like Blenheim, and it was devastating, absolutely devastating. So we effectively took that on to Elstow and obviously the linear lakes effectively in the early days. And
okay, we'll step on to that, because obviously there's quite a link between the way the guys fished at Elstow, and then you brought it to linear fisheries in the sort of late 90s when I met you.
Yeah.
And that ability to find spots, bait up at range of small seeds and pellet and corn, just absolutely blew those waters apart. When the guys that I could see that were really good anglers around you were catching 2 fish, you and your friends were catching 15.
Yeah, it was. I sort of grew up in the area, and we kind of didn't look too far away from our sort of where we were brought up. But effectively, I remember one time a good friend of mine, Carl, sort of suggested to me that we perhaps go to a fisheries called Linear Fisheries, which is over the Oxford area, and I thought, yeah, I'm up for that. So we sort of we doubled up in a car. We drove over there because I knew we didn't need a barra. And we ended up fishing the road bank in St John's, and in those days it was very weedy. Mm-hmm. In fact, the first night I fished on St John's, I struggled to find any spots I was happy with that were clear, and I ended up fishing like 20-yard range off the road bank.
Oh, mega range then.
Didn't catch anything, but Carl next door, who found a spot a bit further out, caught one. And obviously, come the following day, I spent a bit of time trying to find a clearer spot that was further out, and found a couple of monk-shaped features off what we called the dog kennel, or the chicken hut as it was at the time, which was probably about 70 yards. Mm-hmm. And and then started to catch. But I remember in those days there was obviously a lot more fish in St John's in those days, and we used to call it the wave machine. The wave machine would start, and you would start to see fish showing quite a lot, and then they gradually get closer.
Yeah.
Just a matter of time for a rod bust. But yeah, so we focused on spod and fishing yellow. I mean, just yellow. But what was...
When you say yellow, you're obviously talking about the early days of like...
key.
It was like, we call it the plastic revolution now, but it was before plastic.
The worst thing that ever happened. It was the development of plastic corn, because it was quite an art to be able to fish sweet corn at range.
Yes.
And I remember in the early days when I used to fish on Elstow, quite often you were fishing 80, 90, that sort of 70, 80, 90 range, and half the time you were lying in your bivvy wondering if your hook bait was still attached to the hair.
Yeah.
But it was but it was quite specialised, and we refined it, so effectively we would use little slithers of foam between each individual particle, have little caps of foam on the top, used to use fairly thick hairs so it wouldn't cut through the bait. So we refined it to the point I was quite confident fishing at 70, 80. Nevertheless, you probably only had, it was kind of a bit of pressure, because you probably only had possibly 2 or 3 casts at any given time before you'd have to put some new stuff on. So every time, because we were quite accurate in those days. I remember we'd always traditionally use the marker float, find a spot, and effectively I'd try to fish one rod 1 foot to the right, 1 foot to the left, 1 foot to the left, and the third rod it would be either 2 foot left or right on that.
So incredibly, even by today's standards, incredibly accurate.
Yeah,
I think
more accurate than I would ever fish today.
Oh really?
Yeah. I think in those days it was the way it was brought up on us. It was often fishing little clear spots.
And that's the thing I can remember about those days. Those early days was the ability for you guys to put all 3 rods so close. Nobody else could do it. People thought they could do it, but they were putting a rod length apart, not so close. You guys were putting all 3 in the same set of rings. It was amazing.
Yeah, and it was... Yeah, I mean... And in those days, obviously the carp hadn't seen anything like that. And obviously what would happen is 1 take would lead to 3 more often than not. Yeah, on a bad day you'd get 2 takes, but obviously, the fish were coming in shoaling, and bless them, they kind of they had 3 weeks to avoid in a small area.
Yeah, they hadn't seen it before, so it was a very good tactic.
Devastating, and obviously, so the worst thing for us was the development of plastic corn, because it meant anyone could
do it.
Anyone could do it. Yeah.
Okay, now we're going to stop filming now because obviously the light levels are getting quite low. We've left it a little bit late, but we're going to start again tomorrow, and we're going to pick up at Linear Fisheries, and we're going to run through some of those mega hauls that these guys had at the beginning of the plastic revolution. So we'll see you in the morning.